Well, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us for the 16th annual Walter B. and K.W. Sheridan Lectures on Religious Liberty and Separation of Church and State. We are going to get going in just a moment. We have an excellent program in store for you tonight. I'm Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of BJC, or Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. BJC is a coalition of individuals, churches, and 15 different Baptist denominational bodies working together to defend faith freedom for all. And we truly mean all. We mean not just Baptists, but also Buddhists, Methodists, and also Muslims, Anglicans, and atheists. For 85 years now, BJC has headquartered our work in Washington, D.C., but defending faith freedom for all takes place in communities across the country, including wherever you are joining us from tonight. I hope you'll learn more about us on our website, bjconline.org, and on social media at BJC on the Hill. I hope you will participate in today's lectures using the hashtag Sheridan Lectures, and you'll be finding all of the handles for tonight's speakers in the chat box for the webinar. I want to thank the entire BJC staff team for their work in bringing together tonight's event, specifically Charles Watson, Sherilyn Crow, Christine Rigadone, Chris Kearns-McCoy, Josiah Masters, and Carlton Gay. I also want to give my sincere thanks to Buddy and Kay Sheridan for their generous gifts to endow these lectures. In non-pandemic times, these lectures travel to different college and university campuses, and we look forward to continuing that tradition next year. Both educators at Mercer University and now both retired, the Sheridans knew the importance of education to the continuation of religious liberty, and they wanted to see the impact of their gift in their lifetime while continuing that gift for generations to come. We're grateful for our virtual event this year and the opportunity to feature 4 leading scholars on the topic of religious liberty has been white too long. Our title is inspired by a quote from James Baldwin from 1969. Baldwin explained that the lie of white supremacy has had a devastating impact, not just on those who have been oppressed, excluded, and even killed, those like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and now Dante Wright. White supremacy has had a devastating effect on those who have also profited and benefited from white supremacy. At BJC, we are committed to grappling with this truth and to working to dismantle white supremacy from ourselves, from our institutions, and from our understanding of religious liberty. Tonight's conversation is a necessary step in our learning and our listening process. To lead us tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Reverend Charles Watson Jr., BJC's Director of Education. Charles is a native of Millen, Georgia, a graduate of the Citadel, and a veteran of the United States Air Force. He earned a Master of Divinity degree at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology. And in his nearly 8 years at BJC, Charles has taught and facilitated hundreds of groups on the topic of religious freedom and separation of church and state. He also serves as chair of BJC's Committee on Race and Religious Freedom. So Charles, thank you for your leadership in bringing together tonight's program, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's my distinct honor to moderate the forthcoming discussion with such distinguished scholars. Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. She is the author of Soul Liberty, The Evolution of Black Religious Politics in a Post-Emancipation Virginia, which narrates the transformation in Black religious political strategies that occurred from 1865 to 1890. Dr. Teresa Smallwood is the Associate Director of Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She earned a law degree, and in her PhD concentration in theology, ethics, and human sciences informs her multivalent methodological approach to racial justice. Dr. Anthony Pinn is the Agnes Cullen Arnold, Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religion at Rice University, and Director of Research for the Institute of Humanist Studies. Pinn's research interests include religion and culture, Black religious thought, humanism, and hip hop culture. He is the author of several books, including Religion in the Age of Obama. Dr. David Goatley is a research professor of theology and Black church studies at Duke University Divinity School. A globally recognized missionologist, he is a constructive theologian whose scholarship and practice is at the intersection of missionology, Black theology, and leadership strategy. Each panelist will address the audience for 8 to 10 minutes individually, and then all of us will come together for a Q&A session that we want you to participate in. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom platform to share your questions, and we will get to as many of them as possible. Throughout this webinar, we will provide links to resources mentioned during the discussion. Finally, as Amanda mentioned, if you plan on tweeting, please remember to use the hashtag #ShirtandLectures, and also feel free to tag us at BJC on the Hill and tag the panelists as well. Their handles are shown on the screen now. And without further ado, our first presenter, Dr. Nicole Myers-Turner.
Well, good evening. I want to say thank you to Amanda Tyler for the invitation to participate on this panel, and to Charles Watson for organizing it, and to all of the staff at BJC for supporting this event tonight. I want to acknowledge and thank my colleagues who are on the panel, and also all of you who are joining us this evening in the midst of a pandemic. It's not lost on me that we are still in the middle of a pandemic and attempting to do all the things online, and also to do it in the midst of the trial of Derek Chauvin, and in light of the recent shooting death of Dante Wright. But it does seem fitting to talk about the idea of religious freedom and looking at it from a perspective outside of that white supremacy and white power. And so, again, I'm thankful for you all for being here today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how post-emancipation Black Baptists defined religious freedom as a critique of racial inequality. And when I was invited to participate in the panel, and Amanda Tyler explained the origin of the title, linking to James Baldwin's critique of white supremacy, I asked myself, what might we see when we look at religious freedom through the vantage point of freed people? A people in that liminal moment of critiquing and undoing slavery. And it struck me, and I hope it strikes you too, how for them, religious freedom was about fundamental soul liberty, and how that was what they had to protect and wrestle away from the system of inequality that had so long denied enslaved people their fundamental humanity. With that quest for soul freedom in mind, let me take you back in time to the early 1800s and tell you about an enslaved boy named Fields Cook, who, in his pursuit for salvation, came to understand the gravest sin of the institution of slavery, namely that it denied enslaved people the right to pursue their soul salvation just because they were slaves. And I use the term slaves intentionally here to call to mind the systems of inequality that treated people according to labels, as opposed to acknowledging their full humanity. Fields' education came as he began to mature spiritually and to seek a relationship with God, a seeking that he undertook alongside his enslaver's son. And for our purposes tonight, I will call him Dixon. Dixon, who was the same age as Fields and whom Fields considered to be a playmate. As Fields later put it in his memoir, quote, "all fared alike and grew together high fellow," unquote, on the most intimate terms, as if they were brothers. They were so close that not only did they play together, they also began to have conversations about their spiritual lives. Their mutual seeking was ignited by the religious revival that was taking place around the country and apparently in the vicinity of King William County, Virginia, where Fields was born around 1817. In the wake of the religious encounter, a spirit, quote, breathed into both their breasts at one time, unquote, and they began to think about their souls too. Together they prayed and prayed for their soul salvation. but they were too young to realize that they had already received it. This friendship and spiritual bond that Fields and Dixon established and that ensconced Fields in a world that did not seem like slavery was rudely interrupted as the boys grew into adolescence. No longer his intimate friend, Dixon began to behave like, quote, a peafowl amidst a brood of chickens, unquote, lording his slave master status over Fields. Whereas Dixon went off to school, Fields was sent into the fields and admonished to, quote, work, little pig, or die. Fields accommodated himself to this new set of relations, but not easily. He could not determine what hurt more, his mother accidentally scalding him with hot coffee water, or his young playmate, his erstwhile soul brother, now lord, spurning him and treating him indeed like a slave. This was only the first blow that the institution of slavery would deal to Fields' young spirit. The deepest cut came from him being denied the chance to pursue his soul's highest calling, to become a minister of the gospel. This he was denied in all likelihood because of the various laws and prohibitions around Black religion that Southern state legislatures enacted after the Nat Turner Rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. Following that uprising, enslaved and free Black people were prohibited from gathering for worship without a white man present. And as might have been particularly galling for Fields, they were prohibited from being ordained ministers. One can imagine how the clouds of doubt and disappointment and then spiritual frustration and anguish descended on Fields as slavery separated him from his friend, his calling, and his God. Slavery dealt its severest spiritual blow by denying Fields and other enslaved people the freedom to follow God and tend to their soul salvation. In light of this ultimate violence, Fields cultivated a critique of slavery, or rather we can generate and understand a critique of slavery as an institution that denied enslaved people religious freedom. We find all of this in the short memoir that Fields wrote in 1847 after he purchased his freedom. Fields Cook's narrative and critique of slavery offers an entry point for redefining religious freedom through the eyes of free people. From Fields' account, religious freedom was a soul liberty, the freedom to live out one's calling without hindrance. In relating his story, Fields also exposed religious freedom as a critique of racial inequality that denied enslaved and freed people the fullest and deepest expression of their humanity because of their status as slaves. From this perspective, we may now view post-emancipation Black freedom as more than separation, but as pursuing soul liberty, and we may more fully understand critique of racial inequality as a key component of the pursuit of such liberty, as reflected in the activism in which Fields later engaged, eventually as an ordained minister, an activist, and a pastor. Though Fields became free before the Civil War, more than 4 million enslaved people subsequently became free in 1865, and from that point began to stake out the terms of their freedom in myriad ways. In the realm of faith, this has most often been depicted through the separation of freed people into their own churches and denominations. This popular representation is understandable given the spectacular declines in membership in white churches after the Civil War, and the popcorn-like appearance of Black churches across the rural landscapes of the South. But to focus on their ecclesiastical separation alone is to risk missing the unique understanding of religious freedom that free people had. As church historian James Washington wrote, quote, "The founders of the Black church movement were strong believers in religious freedom. They led Black folk in affirming what they believed to be the natural God-given right to freedom, but, cautioned Washington, this was not freedom without responsibility. Souls had to be saved, brothers and sisters in bondage had to be liberated, churches had to be organized and built," unquote. Thus, religious freedom meant for freed people the capacity to critique racial inequality and white supremacy and their doctrines in a thoroughgoing way, and to affirm Black humanity and dignity. That freed people separated into their own churches and denominations did indeed reflect their desire to be separate from white people and to worship under their own vine and fig tree. But they also wanted to worship beyond the oppressive gaze and control of white planters. For being in their separate worship spaces undermined enslavers' claims to authority and superiority through the legislation that had subjected enslaved and freed Black people's worship to surveillance. Separation was also a critique of hypocrisy. For example, as one enslaved woman pointed out, the enslaved were are not allowed to rest on the Sabbath, but instead on that day had to prepare and serve the largest meal to the highest standards under threat of physical punishment. There was no Sabbath rest for the enslaved. Fields Cook's post-emancipation political activism, however, reveals how the pursuit of religious freedom turned from critique into action. One particular instance reveals how the intersection of religious freedom and political critique emerged, where religious freedom was reflected in the ability to worship where and with whom one wished, and where it also pursued Black political and social rights. In spring 1865, Black Richmonders were complaining that the military officials occupying the city were harassing them, requiring them to carry passes to move about the city. An absurdity now that the war was over and they were ostensibly free. And unfortunately, we can still hear the echoes of the same kinds of violence and surveillance in Black communities today. 6 of the local churches were elected, each elected a delegate to carry a message to President Andrew Johnson about the grievances, and Fields Cook was among that group. They did indeed meet with the president, who promised to curb the activities of the military in order that Black Richmonders might move about the city unencumbered. Cook's participation in this delegation reflected what was possible when Black folks gathered in their separate worship spaces. The issues could be identified and strategies for addressing them developed. These delegates critiqued both the system that was supposed to be free and the freedom makers, calling out the inequitable treatment they were receiving and demanding a response. And we can read in all of the different kinds of actions that free people took in the post-emancipation period, from ordaining their own leaders to establishing their own churches and purchasing land. We can read in all of their activities a kind of critique of the system that was trying to undermine and suppress their freedoms. As Fields' story suggests, soul freedom, or religious freedom with an implicit critique of slavery and racial inequality, was uniquely crafted out of the experience of betrayal and limitation under the institution of slavery that so malformed relationships between human beings like Field and Dixon, and intervened between the individual and their God. In this context, Fields, Cook, and so many other free and freed people infused their post-emancipation activities with a sense of purpose, challenging the inequality and injustice where it existed, and securing for themselves a soul liberty. They seized religious freedom to work out their soul salvation unhindered. That work was not simply spiritual, it required political engagement and a trenchant critique of the very inequality that mitigated against it. Our story's protagonist, Fields Cook, understood religious freedom partly as the fundamental soul desire and ability to worship as one sees fit and to answer God's call unhindered. These rights that he sought and that other Black Baptists like him sought focused on the ability to build community and to serve their community themselves. It encompassed a political freedom to participate, to challenge systems that treated them inequitably, and harass them so that they could focus on their relationship to God. As is often the case with rights, the best way to see how they work or do not work is through the eyes of the least advantaged. Here, I have sought to build a discussion that decenters whiteness and that expands the view of how Black people understood and enacted the concept of religious freedom. And in so doing, I've invited our attention to an important source of the pursuit of religious freedom: undoing a system of racial inequality that denied the fundamental human right of spiritual communion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. Now we'll hear from Dr. Teresa Smallwood.
Good evening to you all, and thank you so much both to Charles and Amanda for this invitation. I have chosen to title my topic tonight, African Americans and Religious Freedom, Tearing the Veil from Top to Bottom. Deep symbols permeate the theological and biblical landscape as markers for meaning and purpose. In the ancient world, deep symbols carried meaning where words were often shallow. Edward Farley posited that deep symbols arise within and express the historical determinacy of a community. The community's particular character, traditions, and situation are the locus of deep symbols. This means that deep symbols are historical, and as historical, they are relative to a particular community and thus are changeable. The symbol of the veil has particular meaning for religionists generally and for Black religionists in particular. I'm reminded of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois's famous words about the veil. Reflecting upon his early years as a child, growing up in the hills of New England, Du Bois saw himself as a veiled subject. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, in some sense, the veil was a protection in which Du Bois could freely define and identify himself, separated from the nauseating glare and stare of the children around him who made him feel the depth of his difference. At one point, he articulated his feelings this way, quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." In the words of Ibram X. Kendi, this is the reflection of one who felt stamped from the beginning. And yet, life within the veil conveyed to Du Bois a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to expand, to live, and to hope. That notwithstanding, as Black people in America during Du Bois's life, which ended in 1963, the right to our very faith was veiled. As a consequence of systematic efforts to deny us basic rights, many African Americans relegated the ideology of freedom to eschatological realms. But the basic sentiment around freedom and the African American was established in terms not unlike that of every other citizen. In fact, a group of well-known Black leaders contributed to an edited volume in 1944, originally published by the University of North Carolina Press, entitled "What the Negro Wants." Essays by Rayford W. Logan, the volume editor, and 14 others included W.E.B. Du Bois, Charles H. Wesley, A. Philip Randolph, and Mary McLeod Bethune, to name a few. And they expressed in no uncertain terms the Negro agenda. They wanted to have what everyone else wanted, the 5 freedoms mentioned in the First Amendment to the US Constitution. They wanted first-class citizenship, which for them meant equality of opportunity, equal pay for equal work, equal protection of the laws, equality of suffrage, equal recognition of the dignity of the human being, and abolition of public segregation. These were all of the freedoms veiled from them in society, and the First Amendment to the US Constitution was considered one of the vehicles they would use to tear that veil from top to bottom. In their estimation, the freedom of speech, religion, press, the right to peaceable assembly, and the right to petition the government were the perfect combination of rights and privileges to equalize the playing field for Negroes in America. In effect, it was thought that these 5 freedoms make the people of the United States the freest in the world. I advanced the notion that the freedom of religion stands in juxtaposition to the notions of veiled subjectivity expressed by Du Bois. As a deep symbol, the veil is at once a symbol of what is hidden and a symbol of what is revealed. In the Christian faith, the biblical account of the veil being torn represents the removal of obstacles or barriers to connectivity with God. Its tearing, reflective of the tearing of Christ's body, opens to believers the license to access God for themselves. Concomitantly, I argue, it brings into clearer focus Du Bois's idea of dogged strength. In his seminal work, Dogged Strength Within the Veil, Africana Spirituality and the Mysterious Love of God, Josiah Young, the Wesley Theological Seminary systematic theologian, points out that Du Bois's distrust of the white man's religion underscored what we in the present moment must wrestle with as the singular issue of our day, that the economic foundations of America, and indeed the global world, are predicated and dependent upon racial and ethnic distinctions hierarchically applied to veiled subjects. Fighting the mythical white supremacist ideation from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill and all points in between, such as Mother Emanuel Church or the public street in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd took his last breath. The idea of dogged strength within the veil becomes revelatory for the religious freedoms that come when the veil is torn asunder. What tears the veil? What does the veil cause to tear, and for whom does it tear? As a deep symbol of religious freedom, the veil is torn as those in communion with God recognize, acknowledge, and assent at Jesus' death. It is a dogged strength, born of struggle, resilience, and resistance. Matthew 27:51 states, "At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split." Dogged strength is that power working in us, which is the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. Equating resurrection power with the Du Boisian concept of dogged strength underscores the importance of the imbuing power of God at work in God's people. To name Du Bois's dogged strength in this way aligns with the veil as a deep symbol of religious freedom, where African Americans not only tear the veil, but do so from top to bottom. It underscores the importance of an embodied manifestation of spiritual power. The tearing of the veil from the top is evident most prominently where African Americans mastered every rationality, communion, and convention known to American life, to the point of conquering the highest offices in the land. Ripping the shackles from their feet, hands, neck, and waist, they broke from slavery, lynching, Jim and Jane Crow, denial of rights, suppression of rights, the machinations of to incarcerate at disproportionately high rates, redlining, and the libertarian schemata to privatize education, and the list goes on. And they did so with a dogged strength. Demonstrably, the veil is torn from the bottom when we consider that African Americans have been pinned to the ground by knees on their necks, pressing the very breath of life from their bodies. And yet, the death which ensues shifts the atmosphere in policy and culture around the nation and the world. Never before have we seen such a global outcry for justice from police brutality than what we saw with the senseless death of George Floyd. Gone too soon, but not soon forgotten. In effect, it is this deep symbol of religious freedom that catapults veiled subjects to a place of unveiling, where liberative connections are made for African-American humanity's wholeness and healing. Walter Fluker in The Ground Has Shifted, The Future of the Black Church in Post-Racial America, argues that our older race-based language and metaphors of religious discourse have outlived their utility. I suggest it is a function of religious freedom in tandem with our ancestors who demanded in every generation prior that we shift the nodal of power toward repairing the breach. In the case of African Americans and religious freedom, the breach is constitutive of the historical antecedents which have veiled notions of freedom from the African American experience. The torn veil gives us access to the source, which is God. Our dogged strength alone, which Anna J. Cooper called a singing something, Fannie Lou Hamer called this little light of mine, W.E.B. Du Bois called our spiritual strivings, Emily M. Towns calls the dancing mind, James Baldwin called the fire, Pauli Murray called feeling from the inside, and Audre Lorde called difference. Some might term the paraclete, the dunamis power, the pneuma. It insulates us ontologically from being born and then torn asunder. Our dogged strength is something of an atmospheric shapeshifter, according to Fluker's thinking. It is the quintessential connection between super and natural. The forces that moved the earth when the veil was torn asunder at the death of Jesus are the same forces that have combined to bring seismic shifts in the atmosphere to move policy towards a more equitable world for African Americans. The ground has shifted and the veil is torn because we have learned as a people to operate in the power of the spirit, and that is religious freedom. African Americans have summoned our dogged strength to unleash the power from within, to bring about shifts in the atmosphere, and to break down barriers to full faith and citizenship. Walter Fluker posits the problematized Black body that bears the tropes of stigmata and dread is also a locus of apparition. This means that the body is not only a site of haunting, which implies the symbolic undertaking of mimetic seanced, ghostly ventriloquism in imputed narratives of conquest and domination. It is also a site of conjuring, a type of embodied participation in meaning making that implies some measure of autonomy and grace, and hence the capacity to rename and to shape shift. The veil as a deep symbol of religious freedom offers us the theological fortitude to operate in the freedoms, sacred and secular, which are available to all God's people, no matter the race, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, religion, or creed, and then to rip from veil subjugation those masses who by their dogged strength alone survive and conquer the forces of evil which seek to destroy them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smallwood. Dr. Anthony Pinn.
Like my colleagues, I am grateful for this opportunity. Thank you to everyone at BJC for making this possible. I want to begin by turning to that same agnostic figure that Dr. Smallwood turned to, W.E.B. Du Bois. I share with you this. For several years now, I've been haunted by a question he asked in that book. Now, the book is guided by two questions. He's wrestling to come to grips with the nature and meaning of Black life's post-Reconstruction. And he asked two questions. One, what is to be done with the Negro? And for Du Bois, that is a way of wrestling with the existential and material consequences of enslavement and now freedom in a land that is not free. Access to a social world that still doesn't understand you as being fully human and capable of enjoying all of the rights and privileges that go along with membership in that social world. What is to be done with the Negro? And so Du Bois wrestles with the political consequences of that question, the social consequences of that question, the economic consequences of that question. But there's also a question that cuts to the quick, that moves to the metaphysical considerations. And it's a question that comes early in the text. And again, it has haunted me. How does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel to be a problem? Now, Du Bois is upfront with this. He argues convincingly that this isn't a question that really secures an answer, that white folks are afraid to ask it. And from his perspective, that's okay. He doesn't really have an answer, but it is the fundamental question. How does it feel to be a problem? It's a question that guides the cultural constructions that mark the life geography of Black communities. How does it feel to be a problem? It seems to me that this is the question that undergirds the very construction of Blackness within the context of what becomes the United States. It marks the very beginning of our presence here to the contemporary moment. It seems to me within that process, this dehumanization of Blacks, how does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel to be marginalized and to be of no real consequence in this nation? That one of the major moments in which this comes to the fore, what I've called a ritual reference, is early in our presence here, the auction block. From my perspective, it is at the auction block that our enslaved ancestors most forcefully feel this otherness, most forcefully feel the way in which they have been dehumanized, rendered things of no consequence. And the ability to reinforce this otherness, to convince Black folks on a variety of levels, in a variety of ways, that they are less than, continues to guide the social logic of the United States. From Jim Crow to the present, across the United States, This is the reality. Strange fruit, as Billie Holiday described it, the murder of Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and without deep consequence, further reinforces this otherness. Now, here's the other question. What do Black folks do in response to this process of being othered? How have Black folks responded to that fundamental question asked by Du Bois? How does it feel to be a problem? My argument would be religiosity becomes a fundamental way in which Black folks have responded to that. Now, I want to think about religion this way, not in terms of doctrines and creeds, not in terms of institutional forms, but to think about it this way. Religion is the quest for complex subjectivity. That is to say, religion, Black religion, becomes a formal mechanism by which Black folks have wrestled with the fundamental questions of existence. Who are we? What are we? Why are we? When are we? And that within this context, a sense of religion doesn't require God or gods. And so I would argue there are very real ways in which secular humanism is just as religious as the Black church, to the extent it puts in place modes of thought, processes, and activities that are meant to wrestle with those fundamental questions. Who are we? When are we? Why are we? What are we? How does it feel to be a problem? I think there are significant ways in which the geography of African American communities involves this playing out of religiosity, this performance of religiosity in ways that involve competition. So there is the Black church, but there are modes of Islamic expression that counter Black churches. There are African-based traditions, Ifa, Santeria, that carve out space and provide segments of the population a way to wrestle with those fundamental questions and try to carve out a sense of being, a sense of meaning, metaphysical weight in a world that denies them. And then there are those secular humanists, atheists, freethinkers, whatever you want to name them, who counter this theism and argue that there's got to be a philosophy of life, there's got to be a way of moving through the world, there's got to be a way of wrestling with these fundamental questions of existence, a way of wrestling with this question, how does it feel to be a problem that does not lodge us within churches, mosques, or synagogues, but allows us to appreciate the human capacity and obligation to do within the world. All still wrestling with that fundamental set of metaphysical questions. Who are we? What are we? Why are we? When are we? How does it feel to be a problem? It seems to me that Black religion understood in this way is something of a poetic encounter. Poetic to the extent that it takes modes of engagement, it takes language, it signifies it, destroys it in order to free it to speak a different truth. Takes the collective language of life within the context of the United States and reshapes it in such a way as to include African Americans, to move them from the margins of consideration to the central point of our collective life. Maps them, shapes them in ways that reconstitutes them in a way that allows them to fully recognize and participate in these structures of collective life we've called freedom and liberty. Now, this takes place in a variety of ways, and it speaks to our cultural production. And for my money, one of the most significant ways in which these religious considerations get mapped out culturally is in hip hop culture. Think of someone like Tupac Shakur, who argued the relevance of Black Jesus. And by Black Jesus, he meant the patron saint of thugs, one who recognized the difficulties of Black life within the context of an anti-Black world, shifted the moral and ethical codes of life in such a way as to celebrate the margins. Or think in terms of a Queen Latifah and the call for unity, the obligation to reconceive and rethink community in a way that is much more inclusive, in a way that honors obligation and responsibility beyond the individual, that understands the individual in connection to a greater. Think in terms of Jay-Z and Kanye West. Jay-Z argues you're in the presence of a king, scratch that, you're in the presence of God. Here you get someone wrestling with that question. How does it feel to be a problem? He reformulates it, signifies the question and said, I'm not a problem, I'm a God. That is to say that I constitute what is best about life. Or think about Kanye West and Jay-Z together. Watch The Throne. No church in the wild. They argued. They formed a new religion, no sin as long as there's permission, right? That here you get these artists reconceiving and rethinking moral and ethical obligations in a way that centers life. And they do this without ignoring, without denying the messy and tense nature of our collective dealings. From my vantage point, this is important stuff. That thinking in this much broader way that recognizes that there are tensions, inconsistencies, and conflicts within the ways in which Black folks have wrestled with those fundamental questions gives us a greater sense of the contours and the content of liberty and freedom. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pinn. Dr. David Goatley.
I add my appreciation to my distinguished colleagues for being a part of this conversation today, and I'm grateful. I think my first role as being the fourth speaker is to say amen, and I agree to all that has been said before. I would like to offer my few comments tonight, particularly directed to those who are a part of BJC and who are working for religious liberty. So I'd like to frame it around words of caution and encouragement, particularly for our white siblings who are working for religious liberty. Religious liberty conversations in the United States are often engaged by white leaders who inhabit extremes, and these extremes distort the good work that is pursued by BJC. Many Black religious leaders around the country have not heard about religious liberty conversations at all, and many who have heard these conversations, they've heard the concept used in ways that are incongruent to how so many Black people think and live and believe. On one hand, there are conservatives who operate on an extreme, and they assert that freedom for religion should be defined by their socio-cultural and ideological locations. All Black people know that this is an injurious and murderous way of living. And these have been demonstrated in the history of the United States through genocide, through slavery, and through domestic terrorism. On the other end of the extreme are progressives who promote freedom from religion that is seen, because religion is seen for some of them as an encroachment on their liberty. They want to ban religion from the marketplace of ideas. while perspectives on history, philosophy, economic theory, etc., are seen as belonging in the public square. And so, unfortunately, many religious liberty conversations for many Black religious people have been happening on the extremes. And this is not helpful, and this many of us would reject. Now, the BJC approach is an approach that for many Black people is more reasoned. It's an approach that has potential for partnership among Black religious leaders and Black religious people. It has potential for partnership for all Black people who have been subjected to the injuries of extreme ideological articulations, and injurious to those who have been subjected to those who claim no religion at all. The BJC approach, as I understand it, seems a plausible approach to many Black people, religious and not, because it speaks of freedom both for religion and from religion. Now, here are my words of warning and encouragement. First word of warning. Some Black leaders have felt about BJC and others who are situated similarly, that agendas have often been set prior to engaging them in conversation or including them in meetings. And that by the time Black religious leaders get to the room or to the table, they're there for disseminating information or an attempt to secure affirmation. White religious liberty leaders need to be cautious about assuming that however well thought and however well argued, your perspective can speak for all. Where one sits determines what one sees. And Black vision for religious liberty will enhance life for everyone. So my word of warning is to avoid excluding Black voices from conversations at the beginning, and to be sure that diverse Black voices, not only the voices that are comfortable, but diverse voices that challenge, that test, that question, that they are involved all along the way. Now, a word of encouragement. I want to encourage BJC and others who are similarly situated to maintain engagement on religious freedom in ways that resonate with Black people. We know what happens when religion is imposed: genocide, slavery, terrorism. We know that. The evidence is clear. We also know what happens when religion is banned. The white illusions of supremacy give white people privileges and passes that have dire consequences for Black people with no spiritual anchors and no religious consciousness. White privilege is unforgiving for Black people who forget that they're Black. So a word of encouragement: maintain your engagement in religious freedom in ways that resonate with Black people. Now, finally, I'd like to say that Black perspectives on religious liberty are diverse, but they're clear and they need to be considered. I want to offer these couple of observations. One is that it seems to me that Black people generally embrace freedom of religion and the freedom for diverse practice. Some white people, conservatives, and some Black people who have been overly influenced by them may use language like syncretism. I reject that language and the assumptions that are beneath those allegations. And I'm not alone. Many Black people would reject that allegation of syncretism because there are no expressions of religion that are not informed and influenced by culture. There's no pure expression. All religion is situated in, grown in, and expresses cultural ideas. So Black people in certain rural and southern parts of the country, for example, have relied on long-held cultural practices, even while practicing or prioritizing or privileging Christianity, that some have argued are mixtures of Christian and non-Christian. We reject that allegation. Second, many Black people generally embrace freedom of religion and religious liberty for diverse practices where people can coexist even when they don't practice the same religious understanding. Not only coexist, but collaborate. One example, a historic example, is between a number of Christians and members of the Nation of Islam. Now, there has been plenty of conflict and plenty of diversity. But on the other hand, there are many Black Christians who, for example, may not subscribe to doctrines of the nation, but have valued contributions towards self-sufficiency and self-reliance and rejection of anti-Black racism. So we would not deny people freedom as long as that freedom is not exercised for the demonization, dehumanization, and destruction of people. Again, I want to assert that many of us are supporters of religious liberty because we are not willing to impose a kind of homogeneous understanding to which we have been victim. And so presently and in contemporary times, there are many expressions of religious idea and non-religious that we support. So we support, as Dr. Pinn made reference to, humanists and secularists and other ways of being religious and not, because they are wrestling for meaning. So the way that, at least as I understand, BJC's emphasis of religion, of liberty for and from religion, seems plausible, provided you avoid excluding Blacks from the beginning and insisting on a certain kind of Black voice, and provided you continue to engage in conversations around religious liberty in ways that resonate with Black people and not in ways that seek our conformance. Thank you for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you, Dr. Goatley. Thank all the panelists for their time. I was over here scribbling so many notes with the questions that I had for everybody that was coming through there. I want to start off by, if you will, asking this question of Dr. Turner and maybe also Dr. Goatley. Dr. Turner, you spoke about this is not freedom without responsibility. Meaning, we're fighting for this, but it comes with a price. It comes for a cause. And Dr. Goatley, you talked about the responsibility of BJC and others like us to be able to not only think about the voices of Black people and African American freedom in the beginning of the conversation, and not just bring at the end. So what I want to ask both of you is, how do we be in separate places and still come to the same place, even in the aspect of the church? There was a quote by Dr. Turner talking about separation was religious liberty. Our churches are still separated. Is there a place for us to say, Black churches still need to be Black churches? Is that religious liberty? Or when does that need to come about? When does the togetherness needs to come together? When does that come about?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think, the coming together can happen when an over sort of recognition of, Black humanity, a recognition of the wrongs that have been, and an intention to address them in a genuine way. And so I appreciate so much what Dr. Goatley said about having many voices engaged and bring everybody to the table, and listening to the voices that are uncomfortable. And the ones that are challenging and provocative, not just the ones that, sort of affirm one's own position or where one is or makes one feel comfortable. And so in that way, acknowledging from the perspective of someone like Fields Cook, the lack of acknowledgement of Black humanity was critical. I didn't talk in my presentation about what happened to Fields and his companion as they grew up, but as Cook recounts, Dixon did go on to experience his own salvation story, one where he made amends about, kind of how he treated Fields. And so at least in that story, we can start to see how kind of acknowledging the wrongs is an important starting point to being able to come together.
Thank you for the question, Charles. I'm of the opinion that there is no reason to try to eliminate churches and ignore cultural familiarity and preferences. I don't think that people have to always be on the same campus to be involved in the same project. So if the project is to work toward this world being more humane and habitable for all, particularly those who are the most vulnerable, I have no reason to say people have to subject themselves to cultural approaches and styles and expressions that are so unfamiliar and so distracting that they can't pay attention. I mean, there's some people who have certain ways of engaging their faith life. Some are introverts, some are extroverts. Why impose one approach on them in terms of introversion and extroversion, just like why impose one cultural style? So I don't see a problem with people congregating where they are able to grow and to be challenged and to serve. I think when they're hiding behind that and reinforcing ideologies, then that's a problem. But I don't, when people talk about, and I don't know that this can be demonstrated by the data, but they like to talk about 11 o'clock being the most segregated hour, going to something you said 50 years ago. I don't know that. I think most people go home to segregated neighborhoods, and schools are pretty segregated too. So, I mean, I think I know what they're getting at, but most of the people who I hear lament about that are in majority situations. So my thing is, go join a Black church, go join a brown church, and then you can contribute to, the diversity. So I don't see diversity as a problem. I see it as a positive thing. My resistance is when people practice religion in a way that demonizes others, that dehumanizes others and diminishes life and livelihood.
Thank you for that. Dr. Pinn and Dr. Smallwood, both of you brought questions to your presentation. I think Dr. Smallwood, you said, what the Negro wants was a part of your statement. And Dr. Pinn expressing what do we do in response? So one of our questions from our audience was speaking on Frederick Douglass and his poem of parody, and how Douglass couldn't sever religion from slavery. And even today, religious liberty seems to mean religious bigotry. How can religion be credibly defended today when it's still at it?
Well, I'll go first. The Frederick Douglass piece is always a really interesting point. Frederick Douglass, I think, did exactly what we're doing today. He was someone who interrogated the idea of religion, but he also was one who excavated the nuggets that would enrich his life. So it's on one hand true that he was most definitely a critic of white sort of evangelical and fundamentalist kinds of ways of being, which had a great deal of parody and was essentially just hypocrisy. But it's also the balance is that Douglass was licensed to preach by a congregation of African Methodist Episcopal Zion folk in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And when he published his newspaper, he did so in the basement of an AME Zion church. And more importantly, when he moved to the Capitol in DC, he joined, I believe, Washington's Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, and they still have candelabras that he donated to that church. Reverend William Lamar, pastor there right now, can tell you and show you those candelabras. My point being that Douglass is doing what we talk about, which is to free himself from the shackles of a kind of Christian practice. And let's just go ahead and say that Christianity is not a monolith. You know, it is not a monolith. There are many Christianities. And what he was able to do is ferret out his own understanding and appreciation for religion. He didn't just stop at Christianity either. He studied all of them. And he was able to do his critique because he was conscious. So I raised the questions that I do. And in this particular context, the questions I raise about, who tears the veil has more to do with how it is that we enter. So Paula Gibbons asked the question, when and where do we enter? If religious freedom has been white too long, when did we enter? And I'll tell you, we entered from the beginning. We entered on Amistad, give us free. We entered at a point in time when people could question what was going on in them. And so I raised this book to suggest that by the time Reconstruction was already underway, Black scholars were publishing their position. And Rayford did the editing, but these folk came out. And if you read some of these essays, you know where they were coming from. And it was all inspired by their religious strivings.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass is the man who says he learns the value of prayer when he prays with his legs, right? So he's very pragmatic here. So it seems to me that he and so many others raised legitimate critique concerning hypocrisy, a clear disconnect between what is said and what is done. And so I say this, my context as a secular humanist, right? So I say this as a secular humanist, that there is so much that can be critiqued with respect to theism, but I'm mindful of Maria Stewart. I'm mindful of Ida B. Wells, right? It is complex. I think one of the things we have to give more consideration to is the range of rationales for folks being in churches. right? People are in churches for a variety of reasons. When we assume that there's only one, that everybody is in church because they are 100% theologically in line with what's being said, as opposed to recognizing that there are a range of cultural benefits, right? And I tie it to another question. In my humanist circles, I often get the question, why are Black folks Christian? But these same folks, humanists like me, don't ask the question, why hasn't humanism been more appealing? Right? There are ways in which churches, for example, have provided a soft place to land. Think about the movement back into Black churches in the 1980s, right? Folks who had played by the rules, had done what they were supposed to do post-civil rights movement, right? Live in the right neighborhoods, code switch, dress the right way. And as a consequence, they had given up so much of their cultural selves. 1980s, they began to move back into these churches. And a whole lot of these folks moved back because of cultural connection, right? This was a place where nobody tried to touch their hair. It was a place where they didn't have to explain why they were angry, where they could network, a range of rationales for being involved. And it seems to me, humanists like myself have to raise the question, why hasn't humanism been more appealing? And simply because humanism is without God doesn't make it free of stupidity, right? That humanism has also been involved in a kind of anti-Black racism. For example, I don't know very many humanists, atheists, free thinkers, skeptics who don't have an appreciation for Thomas Jefferson. But as soon as humanists, free thinkers, skeptics bring Thomas Jefferson into their orientation, they have aligned themselves with sexual violence and enslavement, right? So this is to say, the question for me is, what are the best strategies to promote collective well-being, as opposed to trying to safeguard a particular tradition? All of them are messy. All of them have lodged themselves in practices that are dehumanizing, right? No one tradition can claim all the blame and another claim all the good, right? That there is a range here that needs to be taken into consideration. And again, the question becomes, what are the strategies? What are the ways of thinking and doing that promote well-being?
Thank you for that, Dr. Pinn. Thank you for that. I noticed that you talked about labels and religion, and all of us have, each religion has had its downfalls, and just like you said, philosophy has its downfalls in that. But I was struck by Dr. Turner talking about labels instead of seeing humanity. But I also am a person that I would describe myself as a Christian humanist. You know, I came to God by understanding of Jesus Christ, but if that falls short of treating every human being as an equal or better, then I don't want anything to do with it. And so when I think about that, I think about the idea that critical race theory has been attacked by many of our more conservative sides, saying, you know, the idea of Christ doesn't have anything to do with race. And you know, Dr. Pinn, you talked about the social, economical, and consequences of things. And Dr. Goatley, you spoke about making sure we as BJC don't miss a warning to us. So how do we? How would you guys talk about critical race theory? How would you do that in your classrooms, or what would be your expression of people that are against critical race theory?
I'm going to go first and go fast and get out of the way of my colleagues. When I read the conservative, what I want to call them, American conservative evangelicals, which I still think that there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done to declare that is Christian. But when I read those critiques of critical race theory, it doesn't sound like to me that they've read it. And so it sounds like to me that there's some people parroting some shorthand stereotypical caricatures. But it doesn't seem, the critique doesn't seem like a critique of somebody who's read it. So when I hear alleged American conservative evangelicals critique critical race theory, and I'm not saying that it can't be critiqued. It needs to be, as my colleagues say, interrogated and excavated. But the critiques that I read sound to me as critiques coming from people who have not read the material. And I think that that is the depth of intellectual bankruptcy, to claim to be an intellectual leader and make the kind of critiques that they're making. That's evidence that they hadn't read it. So I wanted to get that, and then I'll yield to my colleagues.
I'll go next. You put this to everyone, right? Okay. I want to say that it is the same illogic that would give us fake news, that would say that Donald Trump won the election. It's the same illogic that would contend that Antifa was in charge of the January 6th insurrection. In other words, this is not a critical analysis. This is not an intellectual analysis at all. This is a gatekeeping, what you might call it used to be dog whistle, but the dogs are all out now. So this is more a dog call kind of action. This is a control the population kind of action. Get your Negroes in line. No such thing about race in the Bible. This is an action towards a means. It's the utilitarian ethic of let's do what's going to make us happy here. But if we are real with one another and have no trepidation about where we come from and what we're doing, we understand race has historically been a significant issue in American society. And to have a critical theory about how that race operates is simply not just intellectual, it is imperative. So we give people a framework by which they can do research and practice and develop policy around how to break down and deconstruct the impact of such a problematic situation. That would be my response.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, to what's already been said in terms of sort of needing to have a deeper engagement with the literature, and I would say with the history. I mean, I think one of the value that I see in telling a story like Fields Cook's is how much we already have a beginning root of critical race theory. We can see from his perspective how the institution of slavery was shaping different outcomes for people. And that's, a matter of historical fact, right? That his life was what it was and how it was played out. And so, I would gesture to the literature, to the history, to understanding a little bit more about our past. But I think this is also about perspective, as has already been raised, right? That, there's so much to be said for trying to understand the world, not through your own eyes, but through the eyes of someone else, right? And that you can't fully do that in an imagined way, but like in a real engaged way. And so I think, that's also something to be considered about how does one form community, engage in conversations.
Dr. Pinn, did you want to address that? Or you...
To think the United States is to think race. Yeah. Right? And to deny that is to tell a lie. And so it seems to me that we have to assess the critique, right? And this is clearly a critique that is meant to safeguard the status quo. How much energy does that deserve to get?
When you say that, it reminds me of how I get upset when I hear people talk about reverse racism, but can't see racism. So you do know what racism is, but you only see it when is reversed. And I kind of fall under that with that critical race theory. I'm gonna try to combine two questions I have here to the best of my ability here. And so one person reads, there seems to be a trend in one segment of religious studies scholarship that contends religion is too nebulous of a category to merit special legal protection in the Constitution. I'm curious what panelists think about implications of such proposals would be for Black non-religious groups in the United States. The suggestion that the practice might be simply to protect freedom of speech, provisions, freedom of assembly, but also what to the current appeal of religious liberty by some individuals or groups warrants them to discriminate against other individuals. So to combine that, how do we feel about this idea that religion needs special protection? However, it may be used to discriminate against not only those of different races, but also minority religions. And I will call on Dr. Smallwood first, just because of her law degree there. But what do we feel about that discrimination and using this religion as discriminatory?
So I think that I fall back on sort of the position that Dr. Turner took about labels in a sense. There is a real need to examine how we frame things, right? But at the same time, it is very important to understand that that kind of critique, that kind of ideal comes about in a vacuum, you might say. You can put any label on the practice. And that's why I so appreciate Dr. Pinn's position, that really and truly anything can be religious. If you really think in terms of what Charles Long tried to help us see, we are in a sort of phenomenon of religion, and it goes in various and sundry places. It can be quite toxic. If faith is the thing that drives you, it can drive you over the cliff. But the truth of the matter is, I don't know that it matters one iota, whether we change the frame or we keep it the same. What really matters is the meaning making that comes. That's what I think.
That's open to any of the other panelists that have.
Yeah, it seems to me that a protection against undue influence isn't one directional, right? That there's also a way in which this is meant to safeguard public space so that moral and ethical sensibilities in public space are not defined by the precepts of a given tradition. Here's the dilemma for me. I think historically that religious organizations have been given undue advantage, right? So I think about it this way. I don't know very many churches, for example, that would say, we're not about improvement of our community, right? I don't know churches that would say that, but it seems to me a shared tax burden might constitute resource within local communities that would get some stuff done, right? So if property tax burden were equally shared, what might that resource do for the communities that religious organizations say they love and want to safeguard? So I think there are ways in which this sort of moral and ethical obligation to advance the well-being of communities, there are ways in which religious organizations that have been historically privileged could use resource to get this done. Make the Warren Buffett move. You that have not asked me for this money, but I think it's only right that I contribute it to the well-being of our community. So what we would typically pay in property taxes, we're going to put into community services.
Powerful. Thank you for that.
Well, I understand and value Dr. Pinn, and we're friends for decades. But I think some others would argue that there are contributions that can be valued that may or may not be monetized. And so whether it needs to be a more disciplined approach, I think that's one of those interrogation pieces. I think that when churches or nonprofits or religious organizations are gobbling up land, and there's not a demonstrable investment in the well-being of the community, where it's either a direct cash or in-kind contribution. To me, that sounds like a reasonable thing to debate and to argue. But I would want to register that there are meaningful ways of making substantive and life-giving contributions that may not be monetized by tax dollars. So I'm saying, on one hand, one could argue, pay your share of the taxes. On another hand, one could argue there are meaningful contributions that are being made that would be minimized and taken away from the public good for doing that. And that's a part, I think that there ought to be the free flow of conversation rather than, somebody anchoring in. And, I'm a Christian pastor, so I don't think it's appropriate for somebody to say, no, that's off the table, it can't be done. No, all of that's on the table. We got to interrogate it all. We don't just accept that because it has been, it always should be, or because it has been, it should have been. So I just wanted to offer that as another perspective that some would reasonably offer as a way of making investment in community well-being.
I would say, I know we're getting close to our time here, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, Dr. Pinn and Dr. Goatley, with that, just because the final thing that was coming through our chat Q&A was to say, how can our white brothers and sisters help in bringing religious freedom and pushing more religious freedom and helping the idea of African Americans and religious freedom. And for me, all of you just answered that just by bringing up the fact that you can have different ideas, because I'm pretty sure people that have been in power don't think about giving up their power in that way, and especially in economics. And so, Dr. Pinn, for you to bring that up, Dr. Goatley, for you to say that it should be a part of the conversation and nothing should be off the table, to me is one of the biggest expressions and one of the biggest advantages of bringing and having African Americans at the table in the beginning and throughout the conversation, and a part of the decision making that comes for religious freedom for all people, not from, but for all people in that. And so I have to be respectful of the time that we had together. I hope we had more time here, but I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, Amanda Tyler. I want to thank all the panelists and thank everybody that joined in. And Amanda has a couple of things before we end.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. And thank you so much, Dr. Turner, Dr. Smallwood, Dr. Pinn, Dr. Goatley, for sharing your scholarship, your brilliance, and for challenging us all tonight to think about how religious liberty has been white too long and what we might do about that. Thank you all for joining us here tonight live, your wonderful questions in the Q&A. I hope that you were challenged and learned something new tonight. I certainly did. I want to remind you of more resources on this topic of race and religious freedom available from BJC. Of course, we will have the recording of this available. There is so much here to reflect on and wrestle with. So I know it'll be a resource I'll be returning to often. You can also check out our Facebook Live series from earlier this year on Voices of Black Faith Freedom. We are continuing that series next month when we will have a series on Voices of Asian American Faith Freedom. Hosting conversations like tonight is core to our work at BJC as an education and advocacy organization. I want to thank Buddy and Kay Sheridan once again for their endowed gift that makes this particular series of lectures possible, whether we're in person on college and university campuses or tonight virtually. We are able to bring you great programming like this thanks to generous donors who give gifts of all sizes. And if you're inspired and dedicated to this work, I hope you will consider going online and making a tax-deductible gift at bjconline.org/give to help us continue providing engaging content like this to even more audiences. And finally, I hope that you will save the date of June 18th, Friday, June 18th, for the next event from BJC that you will not want to miss. On the eve of Juneteenth, we will be talking about fierce freedom with our featured speaker, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. So check out more online at bjconline.org/fierce-freedom. Be sure that you are signed up to get BJC's email so you can find out more information about that event. And we look forward to seeing you again on June 18th. We are so very grateful for your dedication to faith freedom for all and for your willingness to engage these hard questions and truths as we seek to advocate for everyone's faith freedom. Thank you again to our distinguished lecturers, to Buddy and Kay Sheridan, to the BJC team for their work to put together this event, and to you for joining us here tonight and for supporting the mission of BJC. Thank you and good night.